One of the primary questions I often receive is, what is Al Qaeda? Is it an actual organization? Is it a movement? Or is it a construct of the intelligence apparatus, mainly the CIA, or a combination of the CIA and Pakistan ISI? Well, it's a combination of all those things. But usually, the general answer is that Al Qaeda are basically the early formation of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Although some of this is correct, it's not the whole basis for it. And I'm going to do my best in this video to lend you, the viewer, about the origins of Al Qaeda. And it started out, innocently enough, in the Patkia Province of Afghanistan. Just after the Soviets signed the treaty to retreat out of Afghanistan, you still had remnants of the communist faction in Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, and of course, the remnants of the government that was left behind. And so by 1991, we noticed with the retreat of the Soviet military, two factions come to mind. That is the Taliban, led by Mullah Omar, and the Northern Alliance, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, and they were fighting for control of the country. However, in another part of Afghanistan, the Patkia Province, located in the capital of Gardez, which is the eastern part of the country, Osama bin Laden, the young Saudi stalwart and one of the magnates for the largest construction company in Saudi Arabia, in which his father owned, the Saudi bin Laden Group. Now, Osama bin Laden himself, during the 1986 to 87 period, became disillusioned with how most Mujahideen fighters from the Afghans themselves saw Muslims or Arabs as foreigners and didn't really enjoy sharing the battlefield with them. And so Osama bin Laden, along with other Saudi compatriots and later Egyptian compatriots, would form a base camp in the Patkia province. In fact, he sent two dignitaries to check out what would be a favorable place to build a training camp. Abdul Azam, by about this period of 87 and 88, had become disillusioned with fighting. He was never really a militant guerrilla warfare type of leader, more of a spiritualist. And that's what drew a lot of the Arabs with him, because the Arabs, unlike the Afghans, were much more fervent in their theological stance. And their theological stance was Wahhabi Islam, which is an ultra-Orthodox version of Islam. Even though many Sunni theologians would disagree and say it's basically an abridged version of Sunni theology. Needless to say, the camp that was being built by Osama bin Laden was finally chosen to be in the Patkia province. And so Osama bin Laden and Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri and Wael Juladim decided to build a camp. And the name of the camp would be al-Masada, A-L, and then M-A-S-A-D-A. And when translated to English, it means the lion's den. This camp would actually recruit just Arabs, no Afghan fighters. They were basically comprised of Saudis, Egyptians, Syrians, Iraqis, and they would train for guerrilla type warfare. This would be a very militant camp because bin Laden was actually surprised to see that there weren't many militant camps in Pakistan at this time. And so he decided to build a camp that would straight be a militant camp, one that would be training in small arms fire, missile launching, weaponry, Stinger missiles, the use of AK-47s, even knife, how to fight with a knife. And so you have a lot of these, and bomb making as well. And so you have a lot of these trades that are happening in this camp, but it was very small. And so you had a very core group of people that was training at this camp. And so I know that you, the viewer, were going to say, well, what's really the evidence for this? Well, in 1998, there would be a document that would be found that would depict regarding the formation of Al Qaeda itself. Now, of course, we not just have this document, but we also have the testimony of one Jamal al-Fadl. Jamal al-Fadl was actually one of the core members of Al Qaeda. And in 2001, he turned state's evidence. But even before that, when he was being debriefed by the FBI, he stated in the trial against Osama bin Laden that a high-level meeting was taking place in a guest house in Khost, Afghanistan. And the spelling of the city's name is Khost. And he was met there by Abu Ubaidah al-Iraqi, Yassin Abu Ayyab al-Iraqi. And they would hand over these documents for Jamal al-Fadl to sign. And it was a document which stated that the designated signer would declare unwavering loyalty to the group. And it would be led by a single emir, which would be Osama bin Laden. And it would continue the jihad outside of Afghanistan. So this would be the jihad against the secular West, most notably. Another meeting would take place with the Iraqis and Jamal al-Fadl, and this would be at the Jihad Well al-Farouk training camp. Now, if that sounds a little bit familiar, it was actually renamed to the al-Farouk training camp, which was one of the most notorious training camps in the late 1990s, and it was suspected to have trained a couple of the 9/11 hijackers, including Walid and Walid al-Shari, Saeed al-Ghamdi, and other notable suspects like Zacharias Moussaoui and, of course, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. But at the Jihad Well al-Farouk, there were many other people at this meeting. And some of these names would be the most prominent names during the formation of Al Qaeda. And these would be very important. So I'll name them here for you. Abu Ayyub al-Iraqi, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, Abu Faraj al-Yemeni, Ayman al-Zawahiri. At this time, he was going under the name Dr. Abdel Moez. Saeed Imam al-Sharif, he was going by the name Dr. Fadl. Abu Burnham al-Iraqi, Abu Hafs al-Masri, who would later become the military commander-in-chief and rename himself Mohammed Atef. Abu Musab al-Saudi, Abdallah Izzaddin, Abu Fadl al-Maki, and Mamdou Salim. All these people would be the primary founders of Al Qaeda. And this group would basically be formed in the Sudan. because after bin Laden retreated to Saudi Arabia to answer the call about the invading Iraqi army on the Kuwait-Saudi border, he actually pitched the idea to King Fahd that he could possibly use the Mujahideen to repel the Ba'athist regime, in which he was denounced right away. In fact, I think King Fahd himself and the interior minister actually decided that bin Laden was more trouble than what he was worth. And so the Saudi defense minister, Sultan bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, who was also the director of the GID, as well as Turki bin Fazl Al Saud, decided that they would meet with bin Laden behind closed doors, according to Gerald Posner, who was a famed author and has done extensive background on Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda in the Afghan war. And according to Posner, it was Turki bin Fazl Al Saud who had an idea to bin Laden, because at this time bin Laden was feared. And so the Saudi government actually revoked his passport, froze his assets, and put him under house arrest. But according to Gerald Posner, Turki bin Fazl Al Saud actually pitched the idea to bin Laden that if he would relocate to another country and not attack the Saudi kingdom, they would actually unfreeze his assets and give him back his passport, in which bin Laden agreed. And bin Laden also added that his family had to go with him, and his wife stood by, but he took his kids and they went to the Sudan. And while in the Sudan, he bought a house in Khartoum, and they built many camps there and bought acres of land. And it was there they built many training camps, and that's where Al Qaeda was initially formed as a group, Al Qaeda. But when they were in Afghanistan, they were basically remnants of the Maktab al-Khidmat, which was in English, it's translated to the Afghan Services Bureau, which is basically a building that recruited foreign fighters, Arabs, to the war in Afghanistan. And when the war ended, the remnants of the Maktab al-Khidmat trained at the al-Masada camp in Afghanistan. And the history behind al-Qaeda doesn't become publicly known until about 1997 or 8. And this would be basically within the talks of the intelligence apparatuses, mainly the FBI I-49 unit and the CIA, and I'm going to assume with high conviction the NSA, because the NSA had actually, at this time and since 1992, had been listening or monitoring Osama bin Laden's satellite phone. And so from this point forward, we started to see the beginning stages of this group, and it would have different factions to it. So with Al Qaeda, they had a Shura Council, which was a religious council for religious affairs, and that was headed by Ayman al-Zawahiri, Abu Ibrahim al-Iraqi, Khalifa al-Muqat al-Mani, Abu Muhammad al-Masri, Abu Burhan al-Iraqi, and there was a couple of others. And then you had a military committee, and that was headed by Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, who was by the way, if I keep using that name, he's a very formidable individual, and he died under very weird circumstances. He actually drowned in Niagara Falls, New York, in a ferry when he visited the United States. And after him, the leader of the military committee would be Abu Hafs al-Masri, who would later be Mohammed Atef. And then you had a Fatwa and Religious Studies Committee, and this would be the committee that would issue the fatwas, declarations, religious declarations. But however, the irony is that most of the actual Sunni and Shia theologians wouldn't recognize these fatwas. These were basically fatwas created by this faction. And that would be Dr. Fadl al-Masri. Dr. Fadl and Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Abu Faraj al-Yemeni. And then you had a media coverage committee, which would later on be called Sahab, Sahab Media, As-Sahab, AS-SAHAB, sorry for the misspell. But the media coverage committee was headed by Abu Musab Reuter. His last name is actually spelled almost like Reuter, R-E-U-T-E-R, which is too weird for me because Reuters is actually a global news agency. So interesting. So the general emir is Osama bin Laden, and the group will be called Al Qaeda, and everyone that was in Al Qaeda would have signed these documents. And it would come out that in 1992, bin Laden would be celebrated in Sudan, and he would purchase much land. And he actually built a huge guest house in Khartoum, and a couple of the high-ranking and later more influential leaders and members of Al Qaeda would stay here. And also traveling with him at this point was Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, al-Zawahiri is an interesting figure. He's almost like he's actually a more prominent figure than bin Laden at this point. Bin Laden is more revered for what he did in Afghanistan. Zawahiri is actually a lot more nefarious. He is actually one of the leaders of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. He was actually a suspect in the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and he went through vigorous torture in Tora Bora Farms in Egypt, in which really he just never got over with, and he was tortured pretty horribly. I've written an article regarding about the torture practices of the SSI, which is the Egyptian Security Services, and what they would do to known terrorist suspects like Zawahiri. And it basically is primitive, but it was cruel. And so I'll even post that into the bottom of the description link to that article, as well as an article explaining about the formation of Al Qaeda that I wrote on Medium. And how would Al Qaeda get its funding? And so in the Sudan, bin Laden actually started a couple of businesses, and they would be businesses inside Saudi Arabia, and they were called the Thimar al-Mukarraka, the Taba Investments, Al-Hijra Construction, Laden International, and Al-Qudarat Transportation. And they would be basically construction magnates, road transportation, even financial businesses. So basically, bin Laden, at the same time when he's doing these businesses, he's actually getting side deals or side offers, payments. And these would later become to be known as payments made out of fear by the Saudi kingdom. Because at this point, in the mid-1990s, the Saudi kingdom was actually a little weakened. And this is actually backed by many of the intelligence apparatuses, including Robert Baer, who is actually a former case officer in the Middle East when it comes to the CIA. And he actually states that during the mid-1990s, the Saudi kingdom was actually fractured in its hierarchy. And many Saudi princes, and there's approximately 7,000 Saudi princes within that family. There's thousands of them, but very few are the real power behind the structure, and they're called the Sudari Seven, and that's the seven sons of Al-Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia. And so with that, these payments would come to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in hopes that they wouldn't attack the kingdom, because it's still at this point, bin Laden saw Saudi Arabia as an affront to Islam, because they were basically allowing the United States military to encamp in the two holiest places in all of Islam, and that's Mecca and Medina. And so the Saudis, and it came out later in the New York article, that the Saudis actually were being blackmailed by Al Qaeda. And so they were pumping hundreds of millions of dollars to bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and not just Al Qaeda, but also other terrorist operatives. And there was Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Boko Haram in East Africa. And so a couple of organizations that they were giving money to. And of course, you had Saudi donors, independent Saudi donors, who actually sympathized with the Wahhabi ideals, this militant ideal, and they were pumping millions of dollars around the world into these madrasas in the Middle East, the United States, Southeast Asia, and later on in Europe. And at about this time, we see that Al Qaeda is still not globally known. Really, in this aspect, a lot of people start questioning that why isn't Al Qaeda really known at this point? Well, for one, really at this point, there was no terrorist attacks to be made here, because during 1994-95, the only real impact that bin Laden would be making was that he actually helped train Muhammad Farah Adid's soldiers with the help of Ali Muhammad, who's actually noted in Peter Lance's book, Triple Cross. If you haven't read it, go read it. It's one of the best books I've read on the subject of Ali Muhammad. Ali Muhammad is actually a sympathizer to not just bin Laden, but also to another Egyptian operative, Omar Abdel Rahman, who's leader of Gamma Islamiyah, who's actually in New York at this time and in New Jersey, at a mosque in New Jersey, Dar es Salaam. And he would be implicated in the landmarks plot a little bit later, which he was sentenced for life. But Ali Muhammad and Abu Banshiri actually trained Muhammad Farid's soldiers to combat the U.S. Special Forces, Delta Force, and Army Rangers. And so this is the first time where the CIA, the FBI, I-49 unit, and some assets within the CIA begin to notice. But according to Frank Pellegrino of the FBI counterterrorism unit and John O'Neill, they said that when they were asking about bin Laden in the period of 1997-98, the CIA would give them huge files, huge folders of files regarding bin Laden. So in other words, the CIA was already been monitoring bin Laden even before the Battle of Mogadishu. And I would probably make a convincing argument that the CIA was actually monitoring bin Laden even in Afghanistan at this point. Although we don't have any really direct evidence, we do have some sources within the intelligence apparatus that do say that the CIA was well aware of bin Laden even in Afghanistan. And how could they not? Because the CIA was actually monitoring the Maktab al-Qaeda in New York. They had an office in New York, which was the Al-Kifa Refugee Center. And so the Al-Kifa Refugee Center is basically an extension of the Maktab al-Qaeda, which is the Afghan Services Bureau in Pakistan. And of course, the CIA was actually funding the Mujahideen at this point, and some of that money may have found its way toward bin Laden indirectly. And so after the Battle of Mogadishu, bin Laden noticed that the American military were not very keen on confronting conflict. Bin Laden actually says that he was surprised that the American military retreated so fast out of Mogadishu, even though they killed so many Somalians in the battle. I think it was at a rate of 30-1. But they did retreat out of the country. And so this is where bin Laden actually said that he could probably take the fight to the United States because he saw, as he says, the cowardice, unlike the Soviets who died in the field and the Americans ran away. And so this is where I think al-Qaeda actually started to ramp up terrorist operations because right after this, the 1996 fatwa by bin Laden stated that only American soldiers were to be killed because of their affront in Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. In 1998, however, this turned around. He did a second fatwa, and this was by the World Islamic Front, or the World Islamic Union. It was entitled The World Islamic Front Against the Crusaders and the Zionists. I think I may have gotten the title wrong. But in this fatwa, he basically declares that all Americans are to be killed wherever you find them, including Jews. And so this fatwa was much more broad in its declarations, and it's much more expounding because not only was he now taking the fight to specific areas where the American military was, now the entire West was at war with Al Qaeda. And it was at this time where George Tenet basically creates a CIA document called The Plan. Not a very constructive title, but it's a title nonetheless, and it was a plan to actually go to war with Al Qaeda. And so at this point, the CIA itself was monitoring bin Laden in Sudan, and because of the East Africa bombings that took place in East Africa, in which it was alleged by, and this is going by the testimony of Ali Muhammad, so take this with a grain of salt, that Ali Muhammad was the one who took pictures of the U.S. embassies in Dar es Salaam and in Tanzania. And so he brought the photos back to Al Qaeda and bin Laden. Bin Laden said that he'll fund the operations, and they took place. The bombings went off, and there was one survivor, Mohammed al-Zawahiri, and he would later testify to John Atef from his bedside in the hospital that he was actually in conversation with someone at the Yemen hub. Now, the Yemen hub is where the al-Qaeda communications hub was at, and it's owned by Ahmed al-Hada, who's a close associate of Osama bin Laden. And so al-Qaeda had all their communications from there. And guess what? You wouldn't believe it. Al-Zawahiri actually gives John Atef the number for the Yemen hub. However, not known to John Atef, the CIA and the NSA already were tracking this number. How? In 1996, the NSA, while monitoring bin Laden's phone, noticed a certain number was calling from Sana'a, Yemen. Sana'a, which is the city, and Yemen, the country, of course. But the number was originating in a house, and the NSA pinpointed the house, and it was owned by Ahmed al-Hada. And so the NSA began a listening device with incoming and outgoing phone calls. The CIA, they got wind of the number, and they built a listening post off Mogadishu, and they could only listen to calls made inside the house because they put a bug inside the house. But they couldn't listen into phone calls that were coming into the house. So you have the CIA and the NSA not telling the FBI about this number. And so the communications hub of the CIA, the NSA, the FBI to an extent, were monitoring al-Qaeda way before the 9/11 attacks. The CIA and the NSA way before the attacks of the embassies or the USS Cole, or even the Millennium Plot. And so al-Qaeda themselves, being that they're a formidable organization, they themselves did not know that their communications hub was compromised. And the number was made public in the transcripts. In fact, The Guardian wrote an article in 1998 and even posted the phone number to the Yemen hub in 1998. So it was public. But basically, who knows about that? And I guess Al-Qaeda itself wouldn't have known about it because they kept using the number all the way to 2002. And so I hope this cleared up a couple of misconceptions about how Al Qaeda was formed, because there is a lot of mystery regarding the exact locations of how Al Qaeda, what day Al Qaeda was formed. And even though that's not necessarily known, we do know for sure regarding the testimony of Jamal al-Fadl and the documents that were found in Croatia. And I'm glad I brought that up, because I totally forgot to tell you about the documents in Croatia that was found. Actually, it wasn't found in Croatia, it was found in Bosnia. So excuse me for being erroneous. According to the documents that were found at the Benevolence International Foundation, which was found in a Bosnian office located in Zenica, Bosnia, in which this evidence was used to prosecute the chief executive officer for racketeering for Al Qaeda, and Inam Aranut. And these papers and documents that they found, which was left behind by Al Qaeda operatives in the Bosnian War, because you had the Balkans War. I didn't get into this because it's a whole different subject. It would take too much time. Al Qaeda was also fighting in Bosnia, which is called the Balkans conflict, in which the nationalists, Yugoslavians and Croatians were fighting the Muslim population. So the Muslims uprising began there. And that was a different jihad. Oh, I'll do a video on that separately too. But there were documents that were found in 2002. And these documents showed a high-level meeting in Khost, Afghanistan, which was 1 year prior to bin Laden's expulsion from Saudi Arabia. And the document showed in Arabic the meeting that was attended by Jamal al-Fadl and the al-Iraqis. Now, these documents are public, but they're not translated. They're in Arabic, and I'm going to pull them up, and I'm going to tell you what they're called, and I'll let you look at them themselves. And if you can, Google something called the Harmony Documents, and you'll see two folders, the Tariq Masadat and the Tariq Osama. And these are the documents that were found in the Bosnian office. And you'll also have a lot of Arabic written papers. I'm sorry they're not English transcribed, but they're very historical. And according to people that use the people who prosecuted Inan Aranut, those documents were translated to English, but they were kept in the private. They were not classified for public release. But it showed that there was a high-level meeting in Afghanistan between bin Laden and members of the Lion's Den al-Mossab training camp, and also primary members of the Maktab al-Khidmat, who all met in Khost, Afghanistan. And those training documents, which you'll download in the Harmony documents, those are in English. And you'll see the what Jamal al-Fadl was signing over in members of al-Qaeda, the primary members who I mentioned previously in the video. And so I'll end the video here. I just wanted to detail about how the formation of al-Qaeda began. And I hope it was a little bit educational for you.